Great to see you. I want to spend just a couple quick minutes here today talking to you a little bit about some of the most effective techniques that I've seen in helping people come up with interesting innovation ideas. Now, when I actually started teaching at Georgetown a few years ago, I realized one of the biggest challenges that people had when they were entering into any sort of startup class was identifying something to pitch. Most of the time, what we do is we identify something that's sort of personal to us. What do we know? What's the current problem? And so that may oftentimes lead to problems that are very consumer focused in some ways, but also things that sort of don't really have a big idea behind them. And so one of the things I began teaching in all my classes was some of the most effective techniques to help people kind of come up with innovative ideas. And so to do this, I actually went on and interviewed about 100 plus entrepreneurs, founders, innovators to ask them their techniques that they use to develop innovation ideas. And from that, I identified kind of 8 common patterns that I thought were really interesting. And in some senses, I will happy to dive into all of those 8 with you. But today, I'm going to focus on the 2 that I find to be really, really interesting for individuals that I think are helpful. I've got longer videos that I've shared with you, but I want to give you a snippet of how to think about some of these things now that might help you as you are preparing for our sessions coming up next week. So the first concept I'm going to talk about is what's called this for that. Now, this is a technique that I find to be really, really interesting that's helpful, is to understand how are we able to essentially identify things that we see out there that are working in the innovation or startup space and apply it to our existing problems. So in the startup space, you will oftentimes hear people saying, I am going to do something like Uber, but for nuns or for wedding officiants, an example here. And so maybe that you understand that very quickly to say Uber for wedding officiants means that I want to be able to push a button and have a wedding officiant join us on demand. So that's an interesting idea behind it. We can very quickly understand how to take an existing startup or innovation and apply it to a different problem space. So that's kind of what this is. Or example, Airbnb, but for pets. And that's an interesting concept that actually was the start of a company called Rover. A friend of mine named Greg Gottesman at a weekend pitch event pitched this idea called, I want to create Airbnb, but for my pet, so that I can have my pet go stay with someone else in their home who loves animals. And so one of the things as you're thinking about those ideas is oftentimes identifying the companies that you see doing interesting things, the products you see doing interesting things, and apply it to your customer base, to the problem space that you have. So that we call that the this for that. And the interesting way to do this innovation process of generating ideas is to start out with that list. What are companies or products that you really enjoy? For example, if you're someone who really enjoys products out there like, something, for example, like FanDuel, which is something that you're really interested in, this idea of sort of sports betting, sort of fantasy football and stuff like that. If that's a company that's interesting to you, understand how it works and identify, is there a way to take some of the core principles of that idea and apply it to something you have? Maybe that's the way that you could get better at customer engagement or community management. But this idea of taking something that is existing right now and applying it that way is really, really powerful. Another example that you may have, again, we talked about Uber, but is there a way for you to do some efficiency by using some of those products? For example, as a way to pull those sorts of things in there. Another example I'll give you is there's a friend of mine who started a company very recently, and he was trying to do something interesting in the medical space. And he realized that one of the things that he saw commonly being done was people were using their phones and the voice recorder to record notes. And so what he asked is he said, I wonder if we could build a product that was the voice recorder for your phone, but to take into the doctor's office. And what it would do for you is transcribe that. It would kind of give notes to it. It would give you the action items so that you and your doctor were on the same page. Because a lot of the problems that happens in medical offices is that people wind up not recording what they said and they can't do compliance on that one. So that's the interesting thing. That became a company called MedCorder, in fact, something very simple, voice recorder, but for the doctor's office. Excuse me. So that's an example of this for that. Identify existing companies, startups, or products that you admire and see how they might fit into an existing customer or problem that you have. Excuse me. The second one that we talk about as well in some of these is what we call the emerging technologies approach. So emerging technologies plays on a similar thing. And then identifying what are some of the most interesting emerging technologies you're interested in. Things like, I'm interested in drones. That's an interesting technology. I'm interested in artificial intelligence. I'm interested in bots. I'm interested in voice recognition software, photo analysis, whatever it might be, and identifying the interesting technologies you have and seeing where those might be able to solve a problem. And again, the interesting thing about this approach is you start with a list of technologies or innovations that you're interested in a macro sense and see how they might apply. So I'll give you an example of that one. There was a company that's called 3 Words. And what they found that was very interesting is that they were looking at some of the technologies that emerged. And in fact, what they found is that using satellite imagery, we were able to now map the entire world in a much more detailed way and be able to actually apply micro geo-targeting to kind of understanding how the world was laid out. And so what they realized from that one is there's an interesting innovation. And they said, well, what could we do with that to drive a business? And so what they were struggling with on their end is they were doing some work in the logistics space. They were working for logistics companies. And what they realized is that because we could now micro create these sort of geofenced areas, we could create 1 meter by 1 meter squares for the entire Earth. And so, for example, if you're someone that happens to be living somewhere that doesn't have street addresses, how are we going to deliver something to you? How will we know where it is? And using sort of some of these sort of geotagging things is very difficult. So what they realized is that they were able to create 1 meter by 1 meter sort of locations at any point in the world with a technology that they call 3 Words. And so what they have now is by using 3 words in whatever order they are, those 3 words can translate for people on the back end into any sorts of location you want around the world. That's the concept, the powerful concept behind this idea called 3 Words. Using some interesting things that we've seen from satellite, geomapping, and applying it to a problem that they have. So identifying those technologies that are interesting can be an interesting thing. And again, we've seen this play out in some of this class exactly. One of my individuals was doing some work in the satellite industry. That was what his company was doing. And he realized that there was this opportunity to some ways use some of those technologies for new uses. There was some new emerging things that were coming in the satellite space that he knew. And so he identified, is there a way for us to take that and apply it somewhere else? And in fact, what they were able to do is come up with an innovation pitch that he pitched to his company about this idea of turning simple satellites you could put in the planet, something they could use at kids' birthday party. Very, very interesting how it played out, but the simple idea of taking an emerging technology and applying it to a new market, either something your company is doing or could do, or something new coming out. Example, drones are something that's very interesting. There was an individual who is doing some work with an NGO for her day job, and she realized that they were struggling to seed sort of naturally indigenous plants in some of these remote areas. And so what she realized is drones are really interesting, and we're out there sort of trying to seed this indigenous plants. I wonder if we could combine these two technologies to do something interesting, and in fact, they are. So those are two of the big ideas that I would say are interesting to approach through it. Developing a list of startups that you find interesting or products you find interesting and seeing, can you apply that to an existing problem or challenge you have, or identifying a bunch of emerging technologies and seeing how those might apply. Those two approaches are the this for that approach and the emerging technologies approach. I put longer videos in there. They're a little bit longer that break on how to do it. But if you're thinking about how to go after it, those are two really interesting ways that you can use to identify interesting opportunities. This for that, emerging technologies, take existing things you're interested in, apply them to problems or challenges or customers you're looking at, and see how something interesting can emerge from that.